It was supposed to be a peaceful return home after a 2-month business trip. The private driveway, the manicured lawns, and the towering mansion, all of it was his sanctuary. But as Marcus pulled up in his sleek black SUV, something felt off. Curtains were drawn where they never were. A strange car sat in the driveway, and unfamiliar footsteps echoed behind his front door. Before he could take another step, flashing blue and red lights filled the cul-de-sac. Within minutes, officers surrounded him, hands on their weapons. And a woman he'd never met before was screaming from his porch that he was trespassing. Marcus wasn't just locked out of his own home. Someone else had been living there. Marcus Bennett had worked for everything he owned. From a childhood in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and leaky ceilings, he built himself into a respected real estate investor and philanthropist. His estate in a gated community wasn't just a symbol of success, it was his reward for years of perseverance. When his business took him overseas for 2 months, Marcus left the property in the care of a trusted security system and HOA oversight. The neighborhood was known for its pristine rules and tight-knit feel. Yet that same HOA had a reputation for catering to a certain type of resident, and Marcus had felt the subtle stares and accidental exclusion since the day he moved in. On the morning of his return, Marcus's flight landed early. The crisp autumn air greeted him as he drove through the ornate gates. But the usual sense of comfort was replaced by unease. There was an unfamiliar sedan parked where his sports car should have been. The garden he'd paid thousands to maintain now had lawn chairs and children's toys scattered across it. Even more unsettling, the security code he punched in didn't work. He stepped back, scanning the windows, when a sharp voice rang out from the porch. A middle-aged woman in expensive athleisure, clutching a phone, glared at him as though he were a stranger trespassing. Before he could process what was happening, she ducked inside. Minutes later, police cruisers roared up the hill. The woman was back on the porch, waving wildly, yelling that this man was trying to break into her home. Marcus's chest tightened. He wasn't just facing a misunderstanding. This was about to turn into something much more dangerous. The officers fanned out, blocking his SUV and positioning themselves between Marcus and the house. Their hands hovered over their holsters, eyes narrowing as they sized him up. He could feel the weight of their suspicion, the same crushing assumption that had followed him his entire life, even in neighborhoods where he owned more property than anyone else. The woman introduced herself as Karen Whitfield, the acting HOA vice president. She claimed Marcus was an intruder, insisting she'd been living in the mansion for weeks with full authorization. According to her, the previous owner, Marcus himself, had abandoned the property, and she was now protecting it from squatters. Marcus's protests were ignored. One officer asked him to calm down while the other took notes from Karen. Her story was elaborate, rehearsed, even including a claim that she'd filed paperwork with the county. But Marcus knew every inch of that house, every detail of its deed. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was trespassing wrapped in arrogance and racial bias. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering. A few even wandered outside, their eyes filled with judgment rather than curiosity. Marcus had been polite, always waved, always paid his dues early. But now, no one stepped forward to confirm they knew him. The humiliation was thick in the air. Karen smirked as she scrolled through her phone, telling the officers she had video proof of Marcus lurking around earlier that day. She conveniently left out that he'd been unloading his luggage from the airport. Marcus's mind raced. How had she gotten in? Why hadn't the HOA contacted him? Why wasn't anyone questioning the absurdity of her claims? The officers seemed more focused on controlling him than verifying ownership. He felt the familiar, suffocating fear of a black man cornered not just by an accusation, but by a system quick to believe it. As minutes dragged on, Karen began talking about how property values needed to be protected from certain elements. She didn't say the words directly. She didn't have to. Every neighbor watching, Every officer listening understood exactly what she meant. Marcus's jaw clenched. He had spent years building a life immune to these kinds of attacks. But here, in his driveway, surrounded by flashing lights, it was happening again. And unless he acted fast, Karen's lies might become the truth in official reports. The tipping point came when one officer reached for his cuffs. Karen stood proudly on the porch, her arms folded as though she'd already won. But Marcus had prepared for situations like this, not because he wanted to, but because experience had taught him to. From his leather briefcase, he pulled a neatly organized folder containing his property deed, recent mortgage statements, utility bills, and HOA correspondence, all in his name. The officers hesitated, glancing between the paperwork and Karen's increasingly frantic face. Her confidence faltered for the first time. She stammered something about fraud and fake documents, but the cracks were showing. Then Marcus made the call. Not to a lawyer, but to the county sheriff himself, a personal acquaintance from his charity work. Within minutes, a higher-ranking unit arrived. They verified his documents on the spot, cross-checking them with county records. The result was undeniable. Marcus was the sole owner. Karen had been living in his house without permission for 2 weeks, using an HOA master key and a concocted story to justify her presence. The HOA board had never formally approved her, but she'd convinced enough neighbors to look the other way. The moment the truth landed, the scene shifted. Officers moved toward Karen, who now refused to meet Marcus's eyes. She sputtered about misunderstandings and just trying to help, but it was too late. She was escorted off the property and her car was towed from the driveway. Marcus stood in his yard, heart pounding, watching as she disappeared down the street. The neighbors who had stayed silent before now murmured apologies, but their words felt hollow. This wasn't just about Karen. This was about every unspoken prejudice that had let her believe she could take what was his, and about the system that had been ready to back her up until the evidence became undeniable. In the days that followed, Marcus took steps to secure his home like never before. New locks, upgraded cameras, and legal notices filed. Karen faced criminal charges for trespassing and unlawful entry, but Marcus knew the case would test the limits of accountability in a system that rarely punished people like her. The HOA issued a formal apology, though it read more like damage control than genuine remorse. They blamed miscommunication rather than addressing the racial bias that had fueled the entire situation. Marcus decided he wouldn't let it slide. He began documenting everything, preparing not just for court, but for a public fight. When news of the incident reached local media, it struck a nerve. The story of a black homeowner nearly arrested outside his mansion because a white HOA member called the cops resonated far beyond the gated community. Emails poured in from strangers who'd experienced similar injustices, their voices echoing a painful truth. Success doesn't shield you from prejudice. Standing in his driveway one evening, Marcus looked at his home differently. It was still beautiful, still a symbol of what he'd achieved. But now it was also a reminder of the fight that came with simply existing in certain spaces. The flashing lights were gone, the porch was his again, and the air was still. Yet, beneath the quiet, a question lingered. One he knew too many people would understand all too well. If you can be treated like a trespasser in the home you built with your own hands, what does it mean to belong?